Welcome to episode 119 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Denning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
My man, how you doing?
I'm doing excellent. Back in town after a weekend seeing a couple of concerts, so I'm feeling great.
Yeah, you've gotten some live music while I was stuck inside, so one of us is doing this better than the other.
This is the first time I've been out to concerts in a while, so it was great.
This being life in that sentence. Good for you. You saw some great bands this week, and some we've seen together, some I think I would be new to.
Yeah, I saw Muse, saw the Struts, saw the Pretty Reckless, who impressed me. Did not expect them. Yeah, that would be new. They were better than I expected them to be. And then I saw Sports Team, which longtime listeners of this podcast know that I'm a fan of that band. We've used one of their songs in the past as the song of the episode, but I saw them at the tiniest club in San Francisco with maybe 60 or 70 people. And then got to hang out with them afterwards a little bit, very low-key. It was excellent.
Yeah, I'd have been trying to track down Cindy Lou Who. She's come a long way, old Taylor Momsen.
Yeah, she's the lead singer of the Pretty Reckless, and I don't know. It was about 2 different days of music as you could possibly imagine. Super tiny club and then huge, very hardcore festival. So very different crowds at those two. But we made it.
I think we're all happy you survived the mosh pit.
I didn't get into the mosh pit.
Well done.
That's not my scene.
Speaking of questionable decisions, what's your cocktail?
Questionable decision of the night is a cocktail that I actually am a huge fan of. I don't think I've had it before on this show. But it was one of the very first drinks that I had back when I was young that I drank way too much of and had an adverse reaction to. But I still like it. It's a 57 Chevy.
Yeah, this is news to me. So elaborate.
Well, first off, it's a beautiful kind of rosy red color. So that should tell you that you wouldn't like it already.
Yeah.
But it's got like Southern Comfort and Crown Royal. There's a little bit of amaretto on there. And then you mix like pineapple and orange juice to get that red color. And so it's kind of sweet, but it's got a lot of alcohol. This is very much my style.
Yeah. Well, as people will soon discover, the theme of this episode is numerical. So your 57 Chevy choice there, it's not just nostalgic. The number in the title, I think, probably sealed the deal for you. And I debated over the same thing. I was going to go with just 11 tequila shots because, well, that's a number. But the wheels would come off. So I went instead with just a glass of Macallan 15, 15 being the age.
Not Wild Turkey 101, wasn't that your second choice?
Yeah, that crossed my mind very briefly. But much like you in a 57 Chevy, I've got too many bad experiences. I'm not trying to relive it quite yet.
Could add a French 75, too. I think you've had that before.
Probably have. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I went with the classic. And you went with the classic song choice.
I did. And again, keeping with the numbers theme, of kind of like early 80s ultra one-hit wonder classic by the band Tommy Two-Tone. And it's the phone number that everybody can never, ever forget. And that is 8675309, or as it's also known, Jenny.
Jenny. Yeah. So if anybody wants a song stuck in their head, we'll link to 8675309. And you can curse us right up to test it.
It's fantastic. What an earworm that is. Once you hear it, you're like, you start finding out you're humming it later on without realizing that you're doing that.
To make a phone number that catchy is impressive.
Well, that is, kind of like the numbering background, because what we're going to talk about is a Logic Games topic, and that is numerical distributions. So we're going to focus on the numbers. And we'll get to that in just a minute. Let's do a little overview of what's up in the LSAT world.
Yeah, and we'll skim through this pretty quickly because people have heard it before, I would imagine. Let's talk very quickly about some key dates for the 3 upcoming LSATs. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about applicant numbers. So the next test, just a few days from now, in fact, is October. It starts this Friday, which is October 14th. It runs on Saturday as well, the 15th. Those scores will release on November 2nd.
Yeah, and obviously, John, you and I will be around on Friday and Saturday watching what happens, collecting information about the test. So if anybody goes through a test experience, good or bad, and wants to let us know about it, please do that. And then we'll collate all that information and information that we receive from our instructors and other sources that we have. And then we'll do a podcast next week where we recap what sections counted, what sections were experimental, make scale predictions, the usual thing that we like to do.
Yeah, so for anybody listening to this, we say it every time, but it bears repeating. Get in touch. Let us know how your day went. We're always curious to hear from you, good and bad, frankly, although we hope it's good.
Indeed.
The next test after that, and the last one of this calendar year, is November 11th and 12th. And same deal, Friday and Saturday, and those scores release on November 30th. And then, since we're just kind of rounding it out, let's talk about the first test of 2023, which is January 13th and 14th. Another Friday and Saturday, pretty standard at this point. What I'll mention for the January test, though, is the registration deadline. Because of these upcoming 3 tests, January is the only one you can still sign up for. If you take October, if you take November, you will have your score back in time to still sign up for January. The registration deadline for January is December 1st. So you will have a little bit of time.
Yeah, you got time, at least for January, especially you can take October or you can take November and you'll still have your results before the January registration. So no reason to jump the gun on that. You can take your time with it. It is interesting, though, to look at what's happening with those test numbers inside what's happening with the applicant data, because both of these tests are fairly substantial tests. October right now is sitting at about 22,675 test takers. This is already smaller than last year's October LSAT, which was probably about 200 people larger. But what we're about to see with October is a bit of a melt. We'll lose a large number of test takers here during this week as they decide, now I'll take November or I'll take January, or I'm just not ready for whatever reason. So we're going to see that number drop, but it's, roughly comparable at this point to what last October was. There was a November test last year as well, and currently this year's November test is significantly larger by about 5,000 people. Right now, we've got about 28,850 lined up for this November. Last year, you had about 23,850 that were floating around. So a good 5,000 less right there. But we're going to lose numbers on this too. Whether or not we lose enough to get down to 23,000 is hard to say. It definitely is possible, but right now we'll just have to wait and see what actually plays out. But those are not small tests either way you slice it up, John.
Yeah, we're definitely going to see some bleed on both of those. Let me actually, this just occurred to me, Dave, and I'm kind of surprised I noticed it because these are the sorts of things that fly under the radar sometimes. They have actually changed the January registration deadline. For the longest time, it was December 2nd. And per their website and per what I just said, they've moved it up a day. It's now the 1st.
Oh,
yeah.
You're right.
I thought that struck me as weird. So while you were doing numbers, I looked it up again and can confirm the deadline's the 1st of December. But if you listen to our Crystal Ball and some of our other podcasts, you've heard us say the 2nd of December. That was true at the time. It's moved.
Well, the better question is why didn't they make a major announcement out of it?
Yeah, they cut
I'm getting tired of
this for people and didn't say a word about it.
Well, these hidden movements in the night, where there's no general widespread information put out about it, they just don't seem right to me. It does not sit well with me when there are small changes made to dates, deadlines, or, policies that they have. And I've complained about this before on the podcast, but operate in the sunlight. Don't operate in darkness, because as soon as you do that and you're an organization like this, there's going to be suspicion. And so right now, I call myself suspicious about stuff like this. Yeah,
I don't love that they've shaved a day off of the gap there, the window, because now you only have one day after the November scores come out. You used to have 2. Not a big fan of that. And like you say, the lack of transparency is concerning as well. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out.
No, that's a good catch by you. I did not even notice it, but now I'll be irritated by it into the night. Well, the interesting thing, though, is we talk about these. We talk about these October and November numbers and say, well, they're very comparable to what they were last year. What is interesting, though, right now is that just this past week, LSAC released applicant data. And in early August, what they do is they end the cycle. They publish their last update with all the numbers and how things turned out in terms of like overall number of applicants, applications they put in, what geographical area, the spread of LSAT scores. And then it goes dark for 2 months.
Right.
So we don't get any updates throughout the remainder of August. You get none in September. And then sometime in early October, you get your first update. And they went ahead and published one, and they've now started updating their numbers that we receive on a regular basis. And so we can actually give the definitive picture into what's happening with applicants right now. And the news is, if you are an applicant, good for you. Applicants are down at this particular point about 12.5%. So that's the actual physical people. Mm-hmm. We're still very early in this process, though. We're only about 1/6 or 1/7 of the way into what we're looking at. Maybe 1/7 is a pretty accurate number.
It's close, yeah.
Along the way. And so it's very early. Things can change, but if you are a person who's looking at applying, that means less competition for you. Fewer bodies for the same number of seats, theoretically. That can move around a little bit too. And I can tell you that from the LSAT score distribution, scores in the 160 to 180 range are down 25% on the whole, which means there's not only fewer applicants, there's a greater share of them came out of the high scoring range. Yeah. So if you can go out and post a relatively high score, 160 or above, you actually becoming more desirable relative to the rest of the population. And you didn't even have to do anything. You out and say get a 165. It's the same 165 as we had last year, but you look better in comparison because there's going to be fewer 165s if these trends hold right now. So This is great for applicants, and we'll keep updating those pieces of information. I update them on Twitter pretty regularly, starting right about this time.
Yeah, we spent the last couple of years really bemoaning the fact that it's been a tough time for applicants. The score bubble was there, huge crush of people, part of the pandemic mostly, headed to law school, and it seems as though the scales are tipping back in the other direction now a bit. So, good news for anyone listening to this still planning to apply.
Yeah, and we'll talk perhaps on another day about theories as to why we'd be seeing a 25% attrition at the high levels, because I want to make sure that it's actually happening before we start theorizing about it.
Yeah, that's fair.
It's still very early. Let's get some more numbers in there, and then we can talk about the various possible causes, because there are several, and some of them are very interesting.
Fair enough. So, to be continued. All right. Well, let's get to the main event. Let's talk about numerical distributions in logic games.
Excellent. So what do we mean when we're talking about what a numerical distribution actually is?
Yeah, it's funny you asked that question because that's part of what actually inspired this episode. The last crystal ball, when you were talking about numerical distributions, comment after comment came in the chat from people wondering what exactly do we mean by it. So let's start with a definition.
Okay.
And I think here's the first thing to understand, and you can elaborate. Every game that you see is going to have numbers involved in some way. Typically, they're centered around the size of the different variable sets. And that in itself can be a confusing term. So explain what we mean by variable sets.
The variable sets are really just the players and the spaces available. So let's say you had a game about 7 clowns. Those 7 clowns, whatever their names might be, that's a variable set. It's not supposed to sound, science-y. The reason we use the word variable is because there's an uncertain element to this. It moves around. Now, let's say you took those 7 clowns, that one variable set, and you said, now I'm going to order them in 7 consecutive spots. Those 7 consecutive spots, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 7, that's a second variable set. It's probably the one we choose as a base in a game like that because it has inherent order. And you could add variable sets really ad infinitum. You could say, well, they've got 7 different colored shirts on. All right, that's a third variable set. They've got 7 different colored noses. That's a 4th variable set. 7 different colored wigs, and so on, and continue onward as long as you wanted to. In logic games, you usually don't see more than 3, maybe 4 variable sets these days. There are games in the past with 5 variable sets, and it can get pretty complicated, but usually they only have like 4 elements in each variable set. But what happens in a numerical distribution is you're relating 2 of the variable sets to each other. And that's where we get numbers playing with each other and being spread across one set over another.
Yeah, so it all starts with just the size of the different groups that you have. The majority of these group relationships or variable set relationships take the form of what we'll call like a one-to-one distribution. In other words, they match. They're the same size groups, 7 clowns into 7 positions, 7 colored shirts for those 7 clowns. These are all even or a word that we use a lot, balance, because they're the exact same size. And that's what we mean by one-to-one. There's one clown for each position, or one shirt for each clown.
Yeah.
When that happens, which is the majority of time, I think people will be relieved to hear, you don't really worry too much about the numbers. They tend to be fairly static. They don't change. They don't move. They aren't active. So you can discount them. What we're going to be talking about today, though, is different scenarios where the numbers maybe don't match or can change or are somewhat uncertain.
And in a lot of cases, that means that there are multiple numerical relationships. When you've got 7 clowns going in spaces, 1 through 7, there's really just that 1 to 1 to 1 all the way on down the line. That's single, and it's fixed in that particular way. We don't worry about it. We just move on from it. It's like, oh, that's obvious. So the distribution is there. And as a test taker, you inherently feel it, but you don't stop and get all excited about it. Largely what we're more interested in tonight are games where it turns out there's not just one number relationship, but often there's 2 or 3 or more numerical relationships. That's what's most interesting. There are exceptions to that, but we're not going to focus on the exceptions here.
Yeah, or it's not explicit, it's not exactly fixed. What we're worried about here is when the numbers can control things. And the example with the clowns that we keep coming back to, I don't know why you pick clowns, but I like it. That is so static and so fixed that it's not going to have any effect on the game. We want to talk about scenarios that would.
Yeah, and I don't know why I pick clowns either. I don't like clowns. They bother me.
Yeah, there's the birthday party clowns and the murder clowns. We could do variable sets with clowns all day.
There's the juggalos. And so there's all sorts of different options. There's clowns everywhere.
So let's talk about exceptions to this one-to-one type of like static or perfect balance situation. And to me, there's really 2 broad categories where you start to see numerical distributions play a role. The first, and to be expected, is when the size of the groups are different, when the numbers essentially don't match. We'll talk about that. And the second is when the size of the groups, the numbers themselves, aren't made static or explicit. Maybe they give you a minimum or a maximum. Maybe they leave it open, but they don't tell you exactly the size of some group or how it's going to actually appear. In either case, different sizes being related to each other, uncertainty being involved, you've got to focus on the numbers as the primary concern. They control everything at that point.
Yeah, and if you miss it...
That's why this episode's so important.
If you miss it, you end up with one of the songs I almost picked, which was 96 Tears by Question Mark and the Mysterians. I came close to choosing that song.
You were pulling some one-hit wonders out for this one.
That's fun to do that. So let's talk about that
96
first
Tears is apropos because I promise when you overlook the role that numbers play, when they play a role, as we're about to describe, man, you are in for a real bad time.
So let's talk about the very first type of scenario that you described where the 2 variable sets don't match and you have too many or too few variables to fill in that base position. Give me an example of what that might look like.
All right, I'll stick with your 7 clowns, let's say, but instead of maybe filling positions 1 through 7, where it'd be a perfect even distribution, let's say they go over the span of 5 weekdays. So 5 clowns are going to be scheduled to do some parties over 5 weekdays, Monday through Friday.
7 clowns will be scheduled over 5 days.
Sorry, 7 clowns into 5 weekdays, Monday through Friday. Now you can see immediately that sizes of the variable groups are different. 7 clowns, 5 days. Suddenly numbers jump right to the front of the line in terms of priority and consideration. What do you do with that excess of clowns?
That's exactly right. I mean, personally, I would be fine with just 5 clowns because I would like to minimize the number of clowns so we can cut out a few. I'm all for it. But you have to then think about what happens with the various rules because it looks, if all the clowns are actually being used and all the days are being used, some of the days are going to have multiple clowns appearing.
Yeah.
And so then is that 2 extra clowns on a day? Is it 3 extra clowns on a day? What do you have? And so you start to watch and see what can actually occur there. You can also have the kind of like reverse fixture. Like let's say you had 3 clowns and they were covering 5 days and all the days had to be covered. Well, now it looks like some of the clowns, in fact, it has to be, are going to be used multiple times. They get a second job, maybe a third job during that same particular week. And so we start looking at how the numbers relate to each other and think, what are the possible outcomes here? And understanding how that works is really critical because you have to say, well, it goes first to the rules. The rules will help you to understand that. And it's funny because when I wrote the Logic Games Bible, I spent a lot of time making numerical distribution drills with all sorts of variations that I could think of that were inspired by rules that I'd seen them use. And, that section of the book is just like drill after drill that says, do you really know this? Can you look at any variable set relationship and automatically figure that out? So if this is not an idea you're comfortable with, there is at least practice available.
Yeah, one of the earliest things I actually encountered around these parts were some of those drills. And they really prepared me for this, both in terms of just the variety that can appear, excess or, again, too few. But they also just forced me to think numerically about every scenario that I encountered. And I think really just the fact that they emphasized it so much served a huge role for me, because when this does come up, and I can't overemphasize it, it's going to be the controlling element of the game.
Yeah.
It's everything.
And you got to watch the rules, because a lot of times they say everybody's got to be used or all the days have to be filled, but you don't have to have that. You can have empty days. Maybe some of the clowns don't have to be used in there. There might be a maximum on certain variables. There's all sorts of wrinkles they can throw in here. But if you don't understand the numerical relationship that's behind all of it, it doesn't really matter if you understand the rest of the rules. It's going to be really challenging.
Yeah. If you're not looking for numbers at the outset, you're going to miss questions, frankly. You're going to give away points.
Okay, so let's go to
that's the first one. Yeah, when things don't match. The other one that I mentioned, and we'll definitely elaborate on this, I think this is actually more interesting, is when the numbers aren't specified, or are, at least to some degree, uncertain. Maybe the exact number of spaces to fill, or maybe the variables to be selected aren't exactly given.
Okay. So that kind of situation is one where you end up having to kind of figure it out on your own. Let's say you had a situation where there's 9 people who are going to be assigned to 3 separate teams. Now, your mind might think, oh, that's going to be easy. Just divide them up, 3, 3, and 3. And that could very well be one of the possibilities. But what if the rules come in and they say, well, we don't know how many people you have on each team, but it's at least 2. Now you have to start thinking, well, maybe, 3, 3, 3 works, but also 4, 3, 2 works. And then 5, 2, 2 works. And that kind of situation where you're thinking to yourself, there's different ways to do this. And I'll just throw in an idea right here, which we call fixed or unfixed. What we're talking about is we're not fixing the numbers to any specific group. So if I say 5, 2, 2, I'm not saying that the first group has 5. I'm saying that one of the groups has 5. That's the unfixed idea here.
Yeah. There's a group of 5 somewhere.
There's a group of 5. It could be 5, 2, 2, 2, 5, 2, or 2, 2, 5. I don't know. If they told me it was the second group that had the most, then I'd say it's 2, 5, 2, and I would call it fixed, because I would know that 5 is fixed into place and the other 2 have to be size 2. But that's one of the situations where you start looking at these rules, and that's where John mentioned before, minimums and maximums and this kind of like open-endedness. So that's the kind of thing where it's not so much about the variables themselves in terms of what's happening with, are they being doubled or tripled or anything like that. You still just had 9 variables. 9 clowns, as it were. You were now trying to figure out how to order or distribute them across these particular groups. So we started focusing a lot on the distribution rules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would imagine anyone listening to this is shuddering a bit, because you can start to see how much uncertainty can exist in these situations. And uncertainty in games, frankly, is a bit of a 4-letter word. It's a scary thing, because the more movement, the less that you know. The more things there are to consider, and the less that you can often do in the setup. So a 9 into 3 groups, a 7-1-1 or a 3-3-3, that leaves so much variability, frankly, that it's an intimidating thing to encounter. But I promise you, it gets a lot easier when you focus on the numbers first.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because if you're putting 9 clowns into, let's say, 3 cars.
Okay.
So you start thinking about that with no rules whatsoever. There's a lot of choices. And let's not even figure about cars 1, 2, and 3. Let's just say 3 cars. It could be all 9 clowns in a single car and the other 2 cars are empty. Or it could be
Which is pretty much the stereotype, right?
Yeah, 3-3-3. Or it could be, 7-1-1 or 5-2-2. You have all these variations. Yeah. They know that there's a lot of choice there. So what happens in Logic Games is they begin giving you rules that pare down and eliminate some of these distributions. They might say each car has to have at least 2 clowns. All right, well, right away, that distributions like 9-0-0 or 8-1-0 and so forth are all getting eliminated. And now you can work inside their parameters. And so they force you to kind of just interpret the information that they're giving. So don't think, hey, I'm going to have a game with 25 distributions. That's typically not the way this works. Usually in logic games, it's somewhere between, when distributions occur in this environment where there's multiple, it's somewhere between 2 and 4.
Yeah, that's fair. Since you just bring that up, I'm going to take a quick sidebar here to mention the way that distributions get created, and I indulge me, which is to say, let's take that situation of 9 people into 3 cars with minimums of 2. Satisfy your minimums first. 2, 2, 2. That's 6 of your 9. Consider your excess and what you could do with them. You put them all in the same car. You've got 5, 2, 2. You start to spread them out, and you get a 4, 3, 2. You spread them out a little more, and you get a 3, 3, 3. So that's a case where you'd actually have 3 distribution possibilities from that construct. But again, that's the kind of thing, if you catch it up front, it completely changes the complexion and frankly, it changes the difficulty of the game itself.
Yeah, imagine that you're standing there and there's 9 clowns around you. All right. And you fight your urge to run. So you're not running, you're not fleeing at this point. You're like, all right, I'm going to get these clowns off my property as quickly as possible. And you're thinking to yourself, there's 3 cars and I've got to get 2 clowns in each one. That's the minimum. So when you say satisfy the minimum, you're like, all right, you 2 clowns in that one, you 2 clowns over here, you other 2 clowns over here. Sounds like me at a bar at like 2 a.m. with all my friends.
So yeah, it's you wrangling your buddies.
Get over here, you clowns. Well, after you put those 6 clowns in those 3 cars, what do you have? There's still 3 clowns sitting there, and they're like, what do we do? And that's where John's saying you can throw them all in one car. You can split them up a little bit, 2 and 1. You can put 1 clown from each of the 3 into separate cars. That's how you should really think about this when you're looking at it. Satisfy minimums and then think about all the variations for what remains.
And this is true of anything. We talked about before 7 clowns into a 5-day week. Satisfy the minimum. You'd use 5 if 1 has to go each day. And then you have 2 left over. What are you going to do? Is there a triple day or do you spread them out with 2 double days? Mm-hmm. But this is the way that distributions get created. And this is such an important idea.
So hopefully, I would say if you're listening to this, that you are familiar with this concept. If not, you need to study it. There are resources out there, whether it's books, courses, what have you, that you need to familiarize yourself with, because this is the kind of thing that when I know, John, you and I see it in a logic game, we begin rubbing our hands and greedily attacking it because we know that it's going to have control. And a lot of times what you find is that once you've made the distribution, you can then go back and grab some of the other rules and use that to show restrictions inside the distribution. Oh, now this guy can't go in this particular group. That variable can't go in this other group, and it starts being more and more limiting, and that makes it easier for you to handle the game. So let's talk a little bit more about just the importance of how these numbers work, because obviously we're making a big deal of it. We've talked a little bit about what it is, how to identify it, different variations on it. So we know it's probably, I would say, the single most controlling element in logic games. It underlies everything.
Yeah, I've never seen a game that fit into one of those 2 categories we talked about, where there's either a mismatch in size or uncertainty in selection, that it wasn't the most important piece. In fact, frankly, that it didn't control literally every decision you make throughout the rest of the game. And that can even be something as fundamental as choosing the proper base if it's not clear which of your variable sets you should lock in place.
Yeah, and as we get into that base discussion, the thing I would say is consider this like a branching exercise. You know, I'm going through logic games, and it's almost like a mental analyst checklist. All right, here I am in the game, and I'm looking at the numbers. Is it just standard 1-to-1? All right, I'm going to bypass it. I know it's there, and I'm going to continue on and, analyze the rules. Although, wait now, is there some type of distribution that's unusual? There's 2 or 3 or 4 of them. Now I'm going to stop and take a moment to analyze what I actually have there and put that together. I don't want to bypass it. I need to go down that particular pathway. And then, of course, as you're looking at those relationships, you've got to figure out which one is the actual controlling base of it, which is the one that's receiving all those variables that are floating around. Mm-hmm. Like when we talk about 9 clowns into 3 cars, it's pretty easy for us to visualize the idea that we're putting the clowns into the cars. So the cars are receiving that, and then we can think, is it 5, 2, 2, and so on. So talk a little bit about the base aspect here in terms of what you're doing with that.
Well, I like that you described the base essentially as like a receptacle. It's receiving other variable sets. And I'm going to say that plural because you could obviously have more than one to put into it.
Mm-hmm.
But when I think about that, the variable set that you're going to choose as your base to essentially like accommodate or accept other groups, I think about choosing something from my base first if there's inherent order to it, which you see obviously in linear games. Days of the week have order, months of the year, floors of a building, numbers 1 through 3, 4, 5, like rankings. These make for great bases, and that's pretty routine. But in a case where you just have two kind of random groups, it can be harder to choose a base in terms of just natural, inherent fixed order. You have to choose instead based on the receiving group and what you know about it numerically. So what I would want to use for a base there is something where I could consider how many things am I going to assign to that position, or to that group, to that group. And I realize that's a little bit high-minded and abstract. I'll give you an example at some point.
Okay. Yeah, you and I actually were talking about this before. There's a great game that we like to cite. It's in the course. It's from PT48, which is the December 2005 LSAT, and it's dealing with technicians and machines. So what happens there in that game?
Right. So you've essentially got two sets of variables, neither of which have any natural order to them. 6 people, I just list them by letter. I think I might actually give their names, but 6 letters. And they're repairing at least one of 3 machines: radios, TVs, and VCRs.
Okay, so
you can tell people and machines, neither of those have any kind of order to them.
Yeah, technicians on one hand, the names aren't, the alphabetical nature of it doesn't matter. It's the technicians and then the machines themselves. There's no 1, 2, 3, 4. There's no cars receiving clowns. It feels intuitively obvious. So what do you do?
Well, you read the rules, at least if you're me, because I didn't have a firm opinion on what to use to lock down basically for the architecture of the game until I read the rules and saw that the vast majority, I think 4 of the 6 rules, were all about the people and the relationships of the size of what they would essentially receive or be assigned. Rules like S and Y don't repair anything in common. That limits them to 1 or 2, but they can't have all 3. Z gets more than Y. U repairs exactly 2. These are the rules in that game. And as soon as they started giving numerical information about the people become the base.
Yeah, so just to kind of like follow in on that, in that game, they say that technician U makes 2 repairs, 2 different machines.
The letters I just listed were the people.
Yeah, exactly. I just want to make sure that that was clear. So in a case like that, we now know that U is 2 spaces. So that's a strong numerical relationship, and we can kind of figure afterwards whether that's a radio, TV, or VCR, whatever the case may be. But you take that information and you start getting the other pieces of information. And what happens in that game is you don't get every single technician locked in perfectly, but you get like 4 of them. I can't remember. I haven't done that game in a while, but you get like 4 of them locked in, and the other 2 have some like one. They have a dual option, I think, whether it's 1, 2 or 2, 3.
I just taught it 2 weeks ago, so I can tell you exactly what ends up happening. 3 of the people, you know not only what machines they get it, but you know exactly how many. So basically half of the game, 3 of your 6 people are done. Of the other 3, 1, you know exactly how many machines it repairs, he or she repairs, but there's a little uncertainty as to 1 of the 2. And then the other people are a little more open, but again, 4 of the 6, you know exactly how many to assign, 3 of which you know exactly what to assign. That's a very, very powerful way to set that game up. And I've tried it the other way, Dave. I imagine you have too.
Yep.
With the machines as the base, 6 into 3, it's a whole different experience.
No, the nice thing is my memory's good. Because I was like, you get 4 of them locked in terms of the numbers, and then the other 2, it's a dual option. And I think it's 1, 2, and 2, 3. That's there.
There's a 1, 2, 3 with Y, I believe.
Missed that part. That's okay though. I haven't done that game in a while, but it is so well known that the recall on that's not that tough. But that's a great example of using the rules to say, well, what are the rules telling you about the actual numbers themselves? And that's the important thing and it also, I think, one of the things I often tell people is you have to go with what intuitively feels right. Because a lot of times with distributions where it's uncertain, you could go either way. One way is usually easier, though, than the other. And that game from PT48 is a great example of that. You can do it the other way. We just think it's harder. And I know that when I tried it and experimented with it afterwards, I was like, what if I did this backwards? It didn't feel right to me. But to someone else, it might feel right. So you can always try it and see if it made more logical sense to you. And that kind of like develops your own feelings about what you're doing.
Yeah, while we're on the topic, another quick tip that has actually bailed me out a couple of times, which is if you're still uncertain as to what to choose as your base, do a quick click through the questions and see if the test makers provide any clues. If you're particularly lucky, you'll see a list question where they lock one variable set in place and then each of the answer choices changes another variable set or moves another variable set around. Match that. Whatever they fix, use that as your base. Whatever they move, use that as the group that you distribute into the base.
Yes, and that's one of my favorite tips, to be honest with you, because if you don't know, you can use the test maker's information. And a lot of times what happens is if the test maker set up a list question that way, it's because that's the way they saw the game. So now you are harmonically in tune with them and seeing the game the way they saw it. And, you know, if you're really like, I don't see anything, I don't feel it, then use the intuition. For me, the clown car example is perfect. I would always assign the clowns to the cars because I just see it logically that way. It feels intuitively right to me. But you can often do it the other way if you've started down that path and you're like, whoops, I should have done it the other way. You can still complete it. Just depends on how much time's been lost and what you want to do with it next.
Yeah, start with the numbers, use what the test makers give you, and then use common sense if all else fails.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, what you get with the various distributions as you look at them is then start exploring them a little bit, because each distribution will have some of its own features. Things will change depending upon the size of the groups. Maybe one distribution has a minimum of 2 with everything. It's like a 2, 2, 2, and you're like, okay, there's movement. Another distribution might be 3, 2, 1, and you're like, look at that one space. There's only a single variable that can go there. That can be a problem once it gets filled. You want to start thinking to yourself, now that I have these distributions, what can I learn about each one? And especially, you might say to yourself, maybe I should go even further than that. Maybe I should actually break it down and start, charting out some templates and possibilities that are underneath each one of these distributions. And you and I think, are somewhat divergent on this. I tend to want to do that more frequently than you. I like to just put stuff down on paper and stop thinking about it.
I'm a little template averse just as a default, but I will say this. One of the few things that tends to really push me over the edge, despite my better intentions, tends to be numerical distributions. If I see like a 3-1-1 option or a 2-2-1 option, and that's it, chances are pretty good showing both of those and trying to fill them in or complete them. That's probably a powerful way to attack the game. And the reason behind that is simple. That's how important numbers are. So these do drive templates for me. They're one of the few things that somewhat reliably would get me to put pencil to paper.
Yeah, see, I'll do that almost all the time just because I like to see it. I like to draw out, especially with a lot of the distributions. We're going to mention a few of them in a few minutes that have been coming up recently, like 5 into 3, and you don't have that many options. I like to see it visually, especially if you fix anything or you can further use the rules to fix some of the pieces. I will often show that simply to get kind of like that picture is worth 1,000 words kind of idea in my mind to be like, now I can see how the variables would move around it. You seem to want to do that a little bit less than me, and that's completely fine. I
just tend to do most of it in my head if I can help it. But this is one of those things because I know how powerful numbers are. When I see this opportunity, this is a much safer bet than normal that I'm going to actually show templates out.
Yeah, and as I've said before, amazingly enough, I'm lazier than you when it comes to this, and I don't want to think about it. I just want to put it on the paper.
We're in a race to the bottom.
I'm just like, put it down. But the beauty is no matter which method you use, you just choose the one that works for you. For me, when I put it down, I'm like, there it is. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to forget about it. It's right there. I can come right back to it at any particular point. I very much tend to use templates in these situations when there's 2 or 3 main distributions in a game. I will almost always explore them. Sometimes I write them down and chart them out, even if I know that there's not going to be a whole lot of information in them, just because the visual aspect of it is so powerful. If you feel that the rules are strong enough and they're really limiting, what you can then do is possibly see whether or not the game has a limited number of overall solutions. Maybe there's 2 main distributions, and it turns out that each of those distributions has only 3 final solutions. So the game has only 6 solutions. They go in two different branches. So I explore each branch, write down each of the three solutions. Now I go into the questions, and I'm essentially impervious. I have all 6 solutions to the game. I'd have to misread something to miss any question. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, how do I know whether or not I should show all those solutions? What are these limiting rules? Go back and listen to episode 21 of this podcast. It's called Logic Games, Recognizing Templates and Limited Solutions. We go in depth on the concept of like what would trigger you to show all the solutions. A distribution by itself is triggering to show all the possibilities, but there may be other things as well, and typically are in those games.
Yeah, I'll step even a little further into your corner here, Dave, because one of the things you talked about back in episode 21, and I've seen you do it since, is the notion of partial templates. So maybe you see that there's 2 or 3 distributions possible in a game. One of them is going to stay pretty open, but one of them really fills itself in. Even just showing the one that largely is complete or is entirely complete, that alone can be a huge asset going forward. Again, it's not my de facto or default method, but I've seen you do it, and I've seen a lot of my students do it and feel like they really invested well.
Yeah, I'm a fan of exploring the pathway until I feel it's not yielding further information. So if I start going down, showing possibilities or templates and, they're built on distributions, I'll go until I feel like I'm not learning anything more about the game. Right. As soon as that stops, I may not have gotten to the end, but I may be like, I'm not getting any further with this, or there's too many possibilities down here. I'll just leave it, move to the next, piece of information I want to analyze. It's okay to do partial exploration here. Sometimes you learn a lot just by going halfway down the road. You don't need to go all the way to the end of the road.
Yeah.
Sounds like a country music song.
I was just thinking the same thing. I heard that in Dolly Parton's voice.
So country music was not the festival I was at this weekend. I'll tell you that much.
No.
It was the anti-country music.
It was. We've talked about this, I feel like, in a pretty comprehensive way, but it still feels to me maybe a little bit abstract. So let's do this. Let's see if we can put a real bow on this discussion by looking at a few recent games and exploring more specifically how it was that they presented templates and the opportunities those templates provided. Or not templates, rather, numerical distributions, some of which were templates.
Yeah, let's do that, because I think that's useful just to in a very surface, non-copyright infringing way, describe the game and just the distribution that they worked through, and maybe what it actually produced, to show you some of the variations of what they do and how at times they can be very simple, but if you miss it and you didn't really capitalize on it, it would cause you an issue.
And let me tell you a secondary benefit to this too, which is, at least it occurred to me as I was compiling some of this recently, was just how often this is still happening. The prevalence of this, the frequency of this, the fact that we can look at just about any test over the past several years and find at least one example tells you this is something you're almost certainly going to encounter, which means it's something you need to be prepared for and on the lookout for.
All right, so let's go.
So I think there's value there too.
Totally. And let's just grab some prominent examples from like the last 5 prep tests here.
Okay.
And why don't you start with the first one? Let's say prep test 87.
Okay, yeah, in no particular order. I think all these are good illustrations. So PT87 was from June 2019, and the 4th game there, a grouping game, had 5 volunteers working this 3-day fair. And each of those 3 days, 3 volunteers work, but no one works on all 3 days. So you have this interesting setup where you've got 3 days, 3 people per day, so 9 total spots, and 5 people to fill them. But you can't have any triples. In other words, none of those 5 people could work 3 times.
So 5 into 9, maximum 2, minimum 1.
Precisely right. And that created, interestingly enough, a single unfixed distribution, basically. 4 of the people had to go twice. That's 8. And then 1 person was a single, worked 1 time. And that was your night.
It'd be nice to know that one. Let's pull another one that was from PT89, which is November 2019. And that was a game you had, I think it was game 3. You had 5 computer technicians, and they were examining 3 computers. So each person was assigned. So all 5 of these technicians had to be used. But it turned out each computer was examined by 2 people exactly. So there were actually 6 spaces to fill. So all of a sudden, you've got 5 into 6. So you only have 1 extra space there. So what that means is one of the technicians will examine 2 computers. Everyone else examines just a single computer. And as you might think, this is a little bit like Sesame Street. When you have got that odd one out, like in John's distribution, that single, or in this distribution here where somebody is doubled, you want to track that variable because there's somebody who, once you assign them, they come back to do it again. They're not done. And that's where distributions are really powerful, is because they tell you who to watch at times and who to look out for.
Or at least the unique number to track. In the example I gave, it was the single worker. In the example Dave just gave, it was the double.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's not that we're saying, oh, always examine the largest number, the smallest number. In this case, it was the odd number out.
Yeah, the unique number.
The unique number, because one of them was even. Let me do the next one, too. Let's pull one out from recent test that actually has 2 games right in the middle of it. This is PT92, and games 2 and 3 essentially feature the same distribution. So game 2 is about 5 tenants living in 3 apartments. And so right away, they start giving you some information about pet owners and so forth. But as it turns out, as you get down into what is possible, you get this 5 into 3 arrangement, and they don't give you a minimum of 1 or 2. So the 0 is possible. There are 3 distributions. There's a 3 and a 2 and a 0 that's floating around. There's a 3-1-1, and then there's a 2-2-1 distribution of the tenants to apartments. Interestingly enough, you go to the third game, the next game in that particular test, and you've got 5 employees scheduled for 3 orientation sessions. And it's the same thing. There's no minimum on it. It could be 0, or 0 is the minimum. So that 5 into 3 gives you 3-2-0, 3-1-1, and 2-2-1, again, unfixed, so they could be in any order. And that's exactly the kind of thing where it's like 5 into 3. If you weren't thinking about that, they hit you back to back with 2 games where having that information is something that you needed to know, because the questions will send you down certain pathways. Sometimes they'll ask about, well, what happens if one of the apartments is empty, or one of the orientation sessions has no employees, or maybe they'll ask you another one where there's 3 attend one of them, and it eliminates certain distributions and focuses you on the other 2. That's the kind of thing you have to watch out for.
Yeah, you mentioned unfixed. They're really kind of partially fixed, because some of the rules did specify certain things about, if there's a Friday afternoon session, then Wednesday has to have more. The pet game 2 from PT92, 3 of the people were pet owners, 2 weren't. But pet owners and non-pet owners couldn't live together. So if you had the 3-2-0, the 3 were all the pet owners, the 2 were the non-pet owners, and you actually would know where they went, apartments 2 and 3 in that case. So there were degrees within the rules, actually, that began to lock these things a little more specifically than just the broad 3-2-0 flying around everywhere.
But what I would say is that you had that 3-2-0, and then the rules began limiting it even further.
Precisely. Yeah.
So from
specifying where they would go.
From a distribution standpoint by itself, it's like, okay, well, that exists, but then now you know even more. And that's when you start thinking to yourself, maybe I should just jot this down, because this is what the solution's going to be in that scenario. And that's always what you do. You take the distribution, you're like, I see numerically what can occur. Oh, now let me take these rules and limit it down even further, because that always happens.
Yeah. That third game from PT92 in particular, I think partial templates were pretty appealing, certainly pretty powerful.
All right.
And while we're on the theme, I'm just going to throw one quick one in there from another test in the 90s, which was PT91, game 4. And I bring this up in part because what you start to see here is a little bit of a pattern. 5 into 3, 5 into 3. This is their favorite one. I actually mentioned this in the last Crystal Bar. You mentioned it, and then I typed it, that 5 into 3 seems to be their favorite kind of distribution construct. We've seen this on a lot of the tests this year. We expect to run into one. So these are really good games to explore just to get yourself comfortable with that. PT91 Game 4 had 5 desk clerks assigned to one of 3 shifts, morning, afternoon, and night. And here you only had 2 distributions because each shift had to be filled. You had a 3-1-1 or a 2-2-1.
And that's exactly right.
Yeah, partially fixed.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of games there that are 5 and 3, and they're different each time because they set minimums or maximums, as the case may be. Another one of the distributions that I think that you had, that I mentioned and that you were typing about in the crystal ball was like 6 into 3. And a good test for that is to go back to PT85, because there's 2 games that deal with like 6 to 3 relationships, and they do it in different ways. But one of the games in there is like 6 people to 3 booths. there's a minimum of 1 to each booth, so you end up with a couple different options there, like 3-2-1 and 4-1-1, because of what happens with the rules. And then the third game on that test does 3 editors handling 6 textbooks. And so each editor is going to be doing at least 1 textbook, maybe up to 3. So there's, again, 3-2-1, and in that case, 2-2-2 distribution. You can literally compare the same 6 and 3 idea back to back and see how it operates differently depending upon which direction it's going. It's very cool to look at that kind of thing and understand I need to be on my toes with this.
Yeah, so there's a whole catalog of recent games that are doing this. And of course, we haven't even gotten into the non-disclosed, unreleased tests that we've been seeing since, which have kept the trend alive. This is something that's happening over and over. Those games are great illustrations of it. But most importantly, I would say be on guard for this, be on the lookout for this, because when you see it, you can capitalize on it. You can turn what would be for most people a very difficult experience into an extremely manageable, even favorable one.
Yeah, this is a tool. You just recognize it and then begin using it to your advantage. It's not a tool that you create. It's a tool that exists inherently there. It's not something I think about you're applying it to the game. You're actually divining it from the game.
Yeah, it's recognition.
It's recognition, but it's still, once you've recognized it, it becomes an asset to you, and it is a tool in that particular way. John, any final words?
I just like the way you put that, divining it from the game.
As you are an LSAT god.
These hidden truths.
Standing upon your hill, divining all from the questions that they give you.
Yeah, there are only a few things that people who get pretty good at games, I think, are still vulnerable with, and this is one of those things. This can be a make or break moment for even really good test takers. So as much as we've tried to overemphasize it, I'm not sure we could, how important this is. But I'm glad we got a chance to talk about it. I've been eager to explore this a little further.
Yep, and I'm going to throw out one last thought before we close it down. If you want to go back and look at one of the classic LSAT games of all time, that is really the only pure distribution. The whole game is distribution in numbers, and challenge yourself to see how good you are. It is a game called Hannah, and it is from Prep Test number 2. This is October 1991. It is game 3. I can guarantee you that if you struggle with numerical distributions, that game is going to give you fits and drive you nuts. Whereas if you are good with them, you will annihilate that game. And that was a real turning point on that test, because that test has a 4th game on it called the Dogs, which is challenging with some challenging inferences. And we could see when people were coming back from that test immediately, the people who were good with numbers had destroyed it. And they were like, that 3rd game wasn't tough at all. And then a whole bunch of other people came back and they were like, I don't even know what I did or how to do that game. I'll never know how to do it. But it's got a couple cool distributions in it. And even that's not giving away a whole lot of information. I just challenge you to challenge yourself to go do PT number 2, game 3. Hannah, she's taking a nice vacation of 14 days, visiting 6 cities in 3 countries. Enjoy yourself.
Well said. I love that game, though.
Me too. One of my favorites of all time. And on that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment and a rating as well. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. We do answer the mail that we get. On behalf of John and myself, we hope you enjoyed it. Hope this was interesting. Have a great week. Stay safe. Talk to you soon.